people who have lived experience with the issue being addressed need to be centered and hold decision-making power. Those who don't have that lived experience need to leverage their power and access on behalf of equity designers, or, we refer to them as living experts.
Welcome to the Health Pilots podcast, presented by the Center for Care Innovations. This podcast is about strengthening the health and well-being of historically underinvested communities. Every episode offers new ideas and practical advice that you can apply today.
Hello, everybody. I'd like to welcome Hilary Sedovic from Creative Reaction Lab, who is with us today to talk a little bit about equity-centered community design and some of the ways that they apply it at Creative Reaction Lab. To start out, what I'd like to do is just share Hilary's background. And so Hilary is the Learning and Education Director at Creative Reaction Lab. She's a social work professional who supports the co-creation of interventions that will promote equitable community outcomes through systems change. Dedicated to curiosity and a growth mindset, you can often find her pointing at things and asking why, or could you say more about that? Hilary is the Learning and Education Director, where she designs and facilitates workshops supporting institutions and individuals seeking to better understand and center equity and inclusion in their practice. She develops curricula and other tools for equity-centered community design process and manages their evaluation strategy. She's a systems thinker and a self-proclaimed evaluation geek. Hilary is forever contemplating interconnectedness, process, leverage points, outcomes, access, power, and equity. Hilary has also supported her local community as a lead facilitator of the Witnessing Whiteness program through the YWCA Metro St. Louis. She guides racially caucused white groups of community participants through facilitated discussion and activities to support positive racial identity development that will spur action towards dismantling racism and promoting racial equity. Now, in there, I also mentioned equity-centered community design, and I just want to pop over here to Creative Reaction Lab site, which I encourage you to visit and learn more about equity-centered community design. I'd like to read what it is. It takes typical design process of defining, iterating, prototyping, testing, and improving. It takes it further by integrating factors that are essential for equitable design practices and outcomes. Humility, history and healing, acknowledging and dismantling power constructs, and inviting diverse co-creators. It centers the lived experience of people and the value of context, recognizing the significant influences that identity and power have on the narratives that we shape around ourselves and others. Welcome, Hilary. It's great to have you here today with us.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
Yeah. Well, thank you for all the great work you do, the positive change you're bringing to St. Louis and nationally, because Creative Reaction Lab is hosting webinars to share this equity-centered community design and the kind of work. So thank you for the influence and impact you're having across the nation.
Thank you.
So why don't we get started by just having you talk a little bit about your background and how you came into this kind of work.
Sure. To attempt to make a longer story short, I usually start with saying that I went to college thinking I wanted to be a high school English teacher and quickly realized that I did not want to grade English papers for the rest of my life.
Good choice.
but recognized that there was an underlying theme for me in my own education and experience when it came to reading and writing, that it was more about feeling seen and my experience being validated through another's work and the way that they express themselves. And so I eventually found my way to social work, fortunately, the second semester of undergrad. And I usually say that that really kind of felt like coming home to my own brain and heart. I often talk about how my parents, my dad as an engineer and my mother was both an editor and was very interested in human beings and psychology. And so combining those things, I think, has made a lot of sense when it comes to social work. And so with the social work education, generalist practice and systems thinking and looking at people in environments and meeting people where they are really has combined with what I think my brain already brought into a space and heart brought to a space. And through that education, I ultimately ended up pursuing my graduate degree and focusing rather than on individual work, where a lot of folks see social workers in action, in casework or in therapy.
Right.
I was particularly interested in more macro level practice. So looking at programs being developed and evaluated and really trying to figure out what does it mean to, how do we best evaluate if we're doing what we say we're doing, and how do we continue to improve, especially with some of these, big systemic issues that we're wrestling with. And so
awesome.
On my way to Creative Reaction Lab was having seen, as many people do, Antoinette Carroll, our founder and CEO, speak at a local event. And I refer to it as the Antoinette effect, where she just, the energy and the what she brings to a space clarity, and the things that she names, yes, it is just often very resonant. And so for me, when I saw her speak and talking about how systems, these systems of oppression are by design, therefore they can be redesigned. For me, I was like, yes, of course. And so I followed Creative Reaction Lab's work for a number of years until there was finally an opportunity. And I was the third full-time staff member hired in 2018. And for me, while, equity-centered community design, when we talk a lot about the power of language, the word design for me, I was like, does that apply to me? Like, no one has ever used the word design in a way that made me feel like that was a space that I should be included in, that I had a right to be there. But when I looked at the concepts and practices and values of equity-centered community design, I was like, oh, well, yeah, this makes complete sense. Right. This is systems thinking. Yep. This is, addressing root causes. This is meeting people where they are. This is valuing self-determination and history. And so that was really my entry into Creative Reaction Lab, and recognizing, yeah, I do have a seat here, and many people do. What does it look like to create spaces where more people recognize that they do belong here and that they have a say in this?
That's awesome. I mean, many people, I'm sure many people have felt it, but many people are simply not exposed to design. But when they are, historically, it's been very elitist. And it's about the designers doing the work for the other people because they're the experts. Yes. And that's one of the great joys of our work here at the Catalyst program, and bringing healthcare and community-based professionals into the world of human-centered design, and showing that we are all designers because we all configure the world in ways, whether we design policies or organizations or hiring practices, all of those things are designed, whether people realize it or not. And so, as you said, realizing that you have a role in designing the world to be more equitable, to break down the structures that have traditionally marginalized people is exactly the principle of what design should be all about. It doesn't have to sit over there in the high design realm of just corporate communications and product design and all those things where it's traditionally practiced. So I love that. So let's talk a little bit about centering equity, stories. Just talk a little bit about doing that work. And I know it's natural for you. I know it's embedded into what you guys do. And as our catalysts listen, talk about some of the things that they need to be aware of as they start to bring that work into their projects, or try to surface equity or histories in their projects. It's a very vague question, I know.
No, I like to kind of process things before answering, because also I often had many thoughts running at once. And so I usually need to pluck a few and filter them. So I think the thing that we start with often, and this is why literally the center of equity-centered community design, if you were to look at the image, which was designed very intentionally, is history and healing. And just outside of that is acknowledging and dismantling power constructs. And so with that, when I think about bringing equity into a space or looking to name it, to amplify it, really starts with narrative and history, where we've all been so steeped in so many systems and values and told what is, how you contribute value to society, or this is the way it's done. This is what it means to be a professional. This is what it means to contribute to a community. And how often those narratives that many of us are socialized in are coming from a space of power over, people who have held power, the various identities, namely, especially in this country and beyond, white folks holding power and through that, their identities constraining the narratives that we're all fed. And so with that, when I think about equity, there's a lot of unpacking and unlearning first, because many of us in our formal education spaces are fed the dominant narrative with no room to question the fact that history is actually dynamic and changes based on who is telling it.
Yes.
And so oftentimes with equity, especially when we're focused on racial and ethnic equity, unpacking some of the narratives, regardless of the identities in the room, of what are we bringing to the space already? What do we believe to be true about the work we are doing, about the ways that we interact with one another? And how do we begin to challenge those? Because I will always be in a space, this is how it's done. Depending on where that narrative came from, or I'm going to ask where that narrative came from, and then I'm going to say, now what's the opposite of that? Because I'm not willing to just accept that anymore. And making sure that we are listening to folks who are saying, like, I know that y'all have fed into that, and that's actually that's not the way. That's not the only thing that's available to us. And so when it comes to centering equity in our work, it looks like so many different things, but I do believe that it begins with unpacking and unlearning narratives and then figuring out what does it mean to relearn it. And we have to really practice again and again and have a space of trying and testing and, centering our own humility and vulnerability to say, I'm a human being. I am here to grow and learn. And we've never had equity ever in this world. And so we can work toward this together, but there aren't very, very clear, well, I'll stop myself there because there actually are some pretty clear action steps of how we can move ourselves there by challenging what is currently, the status quo.
Yeah.
I'm getting a little tangential.
No, not at all. Not at all. I think I just want to highlight some points you're making that are fantastic, which is, first of all, just having a conversation and a reflective space to say, what do we believe to be true? And getting those out on the table and then questioning them. Why are they true? Do they have to be true? Or in your case, that awesome question, what's the opposite of that? How would it look if it was completely different? And that being an intentional process for realizing that there are, to identifying and realizing the inequities in our organization, in our team, in our community, in our sector that we work in, right? So I think that's awesome. We have a learning module in the Catalyst program, which is about identifying conventions and orthodoxies and questioning them. And again, in historical, we have these principles in there that are meant to elicit some of this, but this year we get to bring it much more explicitly. Well, let's identify the conventions and the orthodoxies in equity or power structures that we tell ourselves or that we have in our work. So one other quick question, and maybe we'll get into this a little bit more, but my intuition tells me that one of the hardest things for organizations, and you work with institutions and organizations, not just community members themselves, it's very hard for an organization or institution to be honest with themselves about the power structures that exist. Every year in Catalyst, we have teams where there is a power dynamic that you can clearly see is happening on the team. Is there a way to approach that, or how can teams start to work with that in their work?
And that to clarify, because you named both organizations and then also power dynamics within the teams themselves. Which one are you wanting me to talk about?
Let's talk about the teams. They're interrelated, but no, let's talk about the team first because that's the closest working group, the center of the onion, if you will.
I mean, to me, obviously, or maybe not obviously, I believe that everything starts with relationship building. And, there are multiple people working in equity and justice spaces that talk about moving at the speed of trust.
Nice. And
trust and respect looks like many different things to many different people. And so, in my ideal world, we form a team, we sit down, we're like, here are my identities. Here is how society recognizes them when it comes to power in the way that we have, in this iteration of our country, understood power to look like. And, here's what we need to look out for as we work with one another. that would be, and have an agreement to hold each other accountable and to hold ourselves accountable to when we're starting to fall into those traps, saying, hey, am I doing this, y'all? Or like, so you had named that this might be something that comes up for you. I feel like that's happening right now. And having that conversation and leaning in together. Again, though, that comes with a certain amount of relationship building. We find that ourselves, at our organization, while we have our organizational values and ways of working with one another, and it is very valuable to a lot of folks, especially some people wrestle with it when they come in because they're like, wow, this is great, like co-creation, power shifting. But then they're like, this is hard because it is very counter to what they have been told it means to be in a workplace with one another. Some of our entry-level professionals are like, I know we talked about power shifting, but I guess I still have to overcome this narrative for myself that I have been told that until I reach a certain level of authority, my ideas don't matter. Mm-hmm. And so we've had to practice building people up and being like, you're here for a reason. I want to hear what you have to say. You have decision-making power here. And so when I think about teams, it feels like it has to be, practicing the habit. And so similarly, though, if you don't already have a relationship with these folks, you have to be building a relationship while muddling through some of this tough stuff. That's at least where I would feel like it can and should go, but I'm not going to pretend like it's easy, especially because, again, you don't know folks. So how do you believe that this can be a safe and brave space to have these conversations in a way that aren't going to cause more harm?
Yeah, I think you're saying a great thing about how our teams, which are just getting started, can set the tone from the beginning of part of their commitment in doing this project together is to build a relationship with each other, to build trust so that the work can become even better, so that they can work in a way that pushes the work forward, builds relationships, and actually makes progress in the areas of equity or power structures. I think it's interesting you gave the example of the young professional. I give a talk every year at different college classrooms, mostly engineering classrooms, and I ask, what does it mean to be professional? And I call that into question because they're like, show up on time, do what you say you're going to do. And it feels like the bar is so low. And I think being professional in this day and age, what it is to be, to do work is actually dismantling those power structures that were set up 50 years ago, 70 years ago, as corporations or organizations started building a theory about how to efficiently run companies.
Sure. And so much of that. Oh, go ahead.
No, go.
I was going to say as well, though, what we often unpack around professionalism, though, is that so many of our norms of professionalism are steeped in white supremacy.
Yes, exactly.
The worship of time in a way that we, devalue somebody else's worth and what they can bring if they show up 5 minutes late to a meeting. The perfectionism is part of white supremacy, a sense of urgency that sacrifices equity and inclusion.
Right.
When we're married to a deadline and we're like, oh, well, it would be nice to have folks as, community members as teammates, but we don't have time and we gotta, we only have so much money. Those things are wrapped up in white supremacy. And so that's also what we talk about a lot in our organization. I think that we have some shared ground where we're all working to address white supremacy in ourselves because we've all been so steeped in it. So we can kind of work through that together and be like, oh, I'm in perfectionism right now. And this is what I'm seeing happening. Can you help me get out of this?
Mm-hmm. Awesome. One more point about teams. And I kind of went off on a tangent on professional work, but you mentioned the young professional. And I think this is where the leaders have a really important and hard role for them to play. And it doesn't matter that it's hard. They have to do it. They have to drop their sense of authority, their leadership, that they've gotten to where they've gotten to because they always spoke up first or they always did their job. It's important for them to drop that and become much more humble. Yes. And I find that's one of the hardest things for leaders to do. I'm not sure why, except the world's been telling them the other way is the important way for 20, 30 years in their career.
Right. Well, and I think, when you say that the leaders have to do that, in my mind, I say the titled leaders.
Absolutely.
Because I think that is the dominant narrative of like, this is how you become a titled leader. This is how you hold power. And, I can't remember what I was listening to recently.
I love it.
So on some podcast about, talking about this narrative of knowledge is power. And it is true that knowledge is power, but it feels like it has become knowledge is power through the like, fake it till you make it. So don't act like if you don't know, you better act like you do. If you were wrong, you better not admit it. If you need help, you dare don't say so, because then you are sacrificing the power that you have and you've worked so hard to get. And so I think that's also when we examine those narratives around leadership is, as exactly as you said, the person to speak up first or maybe the loudest or has the most ideas running in their brain that just spew out their mouth. I'm talking about myself right now. But with this concept of leadership, we are looking over and erasing so many people and so much value that people contribute to a space when we are not valuing our introverts as leaders, when we are not valuing other ways of leadership that are not steeped in white supremacy and patriarchy and so on. We're missing a lot.
Yeah. And I think that's the amazing point about this is that when you actually let go and start to listen more, and to bring other voices in, the world opens up. Interesting perspectives, things you never knew were happening because, you never gave it space. And this is what I don't understand why leaders don't do it is, well, we can talk a little bit about why they don't do it, but I think once you start adopting and transforming your practice and breaking down these traditional norms, work is so much more meaningful. It's so much more collaborative and fulfilling as you work through the problem with others, not through, a decision-making process and a time-based, project that you agreed on. Here's the steps we're going to take. And then you get, 2 steps in and you're like, whoa, we know completely different things. We should do this differently. Nope, we agreed to do the project like this. What are you talking about? Since when is adaptability, learning, hearing more, not a good thing in business, right? Or in organizations. Awesome. So what else are you thinking about? I don't have a second question to follow up with that.
I'm thinking about many things, Chris. That's a dangerous question.
No.
I could talk a little bit about what we've seen, and I think I spoke to this already a little bit, but the challenges that folks have when it comes to titled leaders and their buy-in to equity-centered work and engaging in vulnerability and power shifting. Because more often than not, we've had this trend in our workshops and we're working to determine how to best address it moving forward. But where, we do 2 hours, 4 hours, 8 hours of learning together. And at the end, the attendees are like, wow, like this is, yes, absolutely. It's kind of my way of coming to Creative Reaction Lab where I'm like, yeah, of course, this makes so much sense. I want this. Yeah. And then they say, now how do we convince leadership? And I'm like, oh, they're not here? Oh, they're not here. Okay. And so that's something that we've been grappling with of, how many requirements, what kind of requirements do we set for folks engaging in this work with us? Yeah. Of like, if we're doing this work with you, your leadership needs to be there. They need to be there the whole time. And like, they need to be, what does it look like to have that buy-in beyond a one-off? Like, this is not a one-off DEI workshop, diversity, equity, inclusion workshop. This is about planting seeds and what is your sustainability plan and your growth plan. And so when it comes to leadership, again, I come back to like the person in their heart and what the narrative they have been steeped in, that to, especially later in life, when you have really ingrained a lot of narratives and protected yourself. I'm a big Brene Brown fan, fellow social worker kind of thing, but like have really armored up that this is what it means to be successful. This is who I know myself to be. And speaking of Brene, she said in her, we're on a first name basis. She said in one of her podcasts recently that her research has found that one of the biggest shame triggers in the workplace is the fear of being irrelevant.
Interesting.
And I think about that a lot when it comes to these conversations around equity and inclusion, given how many generations we have of titled leadership being white men, that now being challenged to consider that they are no longer relevant, or they do not have the capacity to address these things, that they truly don't have the knowledge and experience. And this is for some folks, it feels like a whole new language. It's a new way of working with one another. And we see that not just in equity work, but, we know that this is a trend in an aging workforce, when it comes to this feeling of irrelevance. And so I think that just brings up even more armor and just like standing your ground and being like, no, I don't need to change. I've been doing it right. I've experienced success. And so, I don't need to be there. I don't need to learn anymore. And it also often in an organization that has been so ingrained with certain ways of working and ways of being, like, wait, but this is going to flip us on our heads. And that sounds really uncomfortable. And I don't know what the right answer is. And so I don't want to do that.
I laugh a little bit because when leadership is really needed, in this case, leadership would be embracing it and saying, boy, I am very uncomfortable with this. I need to learn about it. And I'm going to make sure our organization is investing time and with each other to figure this out. That's leadership, not the title that you talk about, right? Not the title that you've already identified as, well, it's a promotion in the organization and the accumulation of power so that you kind of get permission to pay less and less attention and just say more and more, which is so outdated now and such a horrible way to run an organization. It just won't be sustainable, as you said. This approach won't be sustainable. I definitely hope if any leaders, so-called leaders, and we have to admit you're advanced in your career, you've accomplished great things with these organizations. If leaders are watching this, take a second to reflect on some of the things we talked about in the Catalyst Mindset video that we did. Humility, empathy, equity, and inclusion. And just reflect on where those show up in your daily life, in your work life, and where you could start making progress. I hope there's a thought of doing that and not denying it like, well, we all have to do this. Even if we're talking about it on a video interview, we have work to do. We have to constantly, it's a practice, as Hilary said. So that is. And
you don't have to do it alone either.
Yeah.
Like that's the thing too. And I know sometimes because I get passionate about it, maybe sometimes I come off as like judging or admonishing folks, but really to me, it is more about just saying like, this is just the reality. Like there's only so much that we know and what we have been fed. And that's been my journey, as you named, having led some groups with witnessing whiteness, that was a part of me engaging even deeper in my own understanding of whiteness. And I continue to be in that daily, and I will be in it for a lifetime.
Yeah.
Consistently in our organization. And especially as I have, I'm now the director of our department, which honestly partly has come from the significant growth of numbers of our organization. We went from, 4 full-time staff members, 3 to 4 full-time staff members in February 2020 to now 16. And so with that, I am, Antoinette and I have conversations of what does it mean for me to be a white woman leading this department within this organization that is centering racial equity? And I'm already thinking about succession planning. I'm like, I think I bring value to the space. We talk a lot about the need for both, and this is going to get jargony, so we can link an article, like equity designers and design allies at the table. And so it's not like white folks shouldn't be doing this work, but I am consistently like, how am I, regardless of my intentions, influencing outcomes from a white lens? When I think about our engagements, I'm like, a lot of our audience actually have many of the same identities that I do. White women between the ages of 25 and I think about 45. And I'm like, okay, I can kind of normalize that because I'm like, well, because most of the folks who follow our work are in education or nonprofit, and women are the, higher proportion within that work. And then when we think about equity work and so on, there's just a lot to unpack. And so I've had to then ask myself daily, regardless of my intentions, how am I influencing the decisions that we're making about how we present learning to people and the angle that we put on it? And I'm like, this is why we have a team.
That's right.
It's not appropriate for me to hold all the power and decision-making of how people are learning and what they're learning. Mm-hmm. And that there are times that I can and have caused harm because of that. Mm-hmm. And bringing that to the team and being like, y'all, I messed up. And so when I think about, this calling leaders, titled leaders and beyond into this conversation, it really does take discomfort, but sitting with that in ourselves. And it doesn't mean we're bad people or we're broken. We're human beings. And because of that, though, we also have a responsibility that once we know about it, we need to dig deeper. And that's, to me, that's the journey.
Yeah, awesome. I would just encourage, I think people fear the feelings that come with that, the either guilt or
shame,
huge one. But what people don't realize is by sitting with it and moving into it and inviting other people to collaborate with you, that's the healing part of it. That's the part that will make the shame go away as you make progress with others and realize that you're improving on what was happening before. I just can't emphasize enough that when you start doing the work, the meaningfulness and the satisfaction of your work just goes way up instead of the fear of shame or what are people going to think or I'm just going to constantly be called out at meetings. But when you start doing the work with others and letting them lead, adopting their suggestions of how others could learn this content because they have the lived experience that you're trying to support and access, it just makes everything better. And hopefully people can get over the shame and fear to enter that work. So I want to respect your time. Is there something you'd like to share with our teams who are starting on projects, everything from food insecurity to serving families with parents coming back from incarceration to addiction support services, the wide range of ways our 12 or 13 teams are engaging with community? What are some of the advice or lessons you would share with them? Maybe advice or thoughts that might help them do this work. Good luck.
Yeah. No, there, as you can tell, probably I could talk about it for a long time. I think
appreciate that.
Some of the things that I come back to is this framing that we have of, the movement of redesigners for justice. And that's when I mentioned equity designers and design allies. This is the way that we distinguish, what your role should be. In various cases, it's contextual in redesigning for justice. So people who have lived experience with the issue being addressed need to be centered and hold decision-making power. And we need to leverage those who don't have that lived experience need to leverage their power and access on behalf of equity designers, or, we refer to them as living experts. And that can look like many things. And it absolutely also includes paying people for their time as living experts and really considering the history of, as you mentioned earlier, Chris, this, Antoinette often refers to it as the yo-yo effect that she experienced growing up, where some do-gooders come in, they say, we're going to fix this for you. We've talked to you for a little bit. Now we're going to go back here behind our closed doors. We're going to come up with something. And then, they might ask what you think about it before they implement. But otherwise they're like, here's what we made for you. Good luck. Bye. And so considering, regardless of if you have directly done that in this community or not, that narrative is there. There's already been harm done.
That's right.
And so starting from a place of relationship and process, being the center of things in quality and relationship versus solely focused on product and outcome, that is where we can move more toward equity when we are on that foundation of relationship and connection to community and, collective investment, both like hard investment and financial investment and all of these things.
Time investment.
To move this forward. Exactly. And so, I think a lot about not only, how do we engage community members in this work as team members, but in your team as well, considering the various identities that you hold and in which spaces various folks' identities and experiences should be centered. So, for example, if we were working on something that was addressing reproductive justice, that would be something I have lived experience with. Now, if it were an issue that was directly affecting Black women, I think about especially in St. Louis, where we have horrific rates of infant mortality and maternal mortality in some of our zip codes that are comparable to that of, we call it now the global South, that is not my space to be the decision maker. I need to move as much as possible to center the decision-making power and expertise of people who have that lived experience, because it is super valuable. And they don't need to have PhDs. They don't need to have written a book about it or, be on panels about it, although we should invite people and pay them to speak about it. But we really need to be re-examining what expertise means. And that with ourselves as well. And so I think that's one piece of advice that I would give, and to consistently, be challenging ourselves of, our first thoughts saying, and why do I think that? And some people are like, that sounds really tiring. And I'm like, it is.
Exactly.
There's a lot happening up there and it is tiring, but also that's how we're going to push against the status quo and create something different.
That's right. We might say you have to use beginner's mind. You have to see everything as new, like a child does, because none of those biases exist early on. And that's a good way of questioning, that you're curious and you take beginner's mind to your work. And it's a little less about constantly questioning yourself, but exploring and creating, creatively exploring the space.
Yeah.
Hilary, you're amazing. I want to thank you so much for taking time this morning. We have a lot to learn from you, from Creative Reaction Lab, from the lived experience experts. And I just think that, I keep reflecting on, we used to call, in the design world, everybody was a user that you were designing for. And I think the shift to living experts is far more appropriate, because that both implies that they are the experts who know what's happening, that you will learn from, and they are the ones who know what kinds of potential solutions will be adopted, be helpful, will create value, et cetera. Such a wonderful shift.
Thank you for tuning in to Health Pilots, hosted by the Center for Care Innovations, with podcast production services by Wayfair Recording Company. If you like what you heard, please spread the word and be sure to subscribe where you listen to podcasts. For more information about the Center for Care Innovations, or for upcoming programming events and funding opportunities, please visit our website, careinnovations.org, and connect with us on LinkedIn and Twitter. We'll catch you here on the next episode of Health Pilots.